As a rule, the main mystery in a murder case is identifying who committed it. In this instance, however, we know from the very beginning who pulled the trigger. The question is, was it a terrible mistake or a cold-blooded murder? Linda and Patrick Duffy had been happily married until April 26, 2007, when Linda made a panicked call to Los Angeles Emergency Services. When police officers arrived, they found Patrick Duffy on the couch. His left hand rested in his pocket, and his right knee was propped on a cushion. The man's position appeared comfortable, relaxed, as if he were simply asleep. But he wasn't. He was dead. His head, along with the couch, the walls, and the living room floor, was spattered with drying blood. It didn't take an expert to realize the man had been shot in the head. At first glance, Detective Shannon Lauren thought Patrick had lain down to rest on the couch when someone entered and shot him. Her partner, Sean McCarthy, leaned toward the idea of an accident. After 13 years of investigating crimes, he knew how to notice the smallest details, and here he saw nothing suspicious. The couple's two teenage sons, Sean and Thomas, were at school, leaving Linda as the sole witness to what had happened. She agreed to go to the station with the detectives and, without a lawyer, willingly answered their questions all night long. Linda Duffy was always unique. She had an unshakable, cheerful disposition, positive, lively, and full of humor. Wake her up in the middle of the night and she'd happily share a funny story. Some even called her a chameleon for her habit of mimicking different accents. Despite her quirks and eccentricities, those who knew Linda adored her. She was a wonderful person and a great friend. In the 1980s, she met her perfect match, Patrick Duffy. Patrick was an electronics engineer, a private pilot, and a firearms enthusiast. Linda often said her dreams had come true and that she couldn't have been happier. After dating for 4 years, they decided to get married. Friends and family alike believed the couple had truly found soulmates in one another, sharing a love for jokes, pranks, and playful antics. It was precisely this playful streak that became the cornerstone of Linda's account of what happened that day. She explained that she and Patrick had returned from the hospital where he had been treated for chronic circulation issues. Patrick was planning to visit the shooting range afterward. Normally, one of his 3 revolvers was kept in a small locked case, but that day, it was lying next to him. Linda usually didn't touch firearms, but that day she picked it up to have a closer look. And that's where her story began to take a bizarre turn. She said she asked Patrick where the bullets were, and he replied, "Over there." Then, mimicking the voice of the famous cartoon character Elmer Fudd, he added,
"No more bullets."
Laughing, Linda repeated,
"No more bullets?"
assuming the chamber was empty. She thought it would be safe to try a trick Patrick had once taught her. Through tears, she told detectives that she only wanted to impress her husband by showing off her cowboy-style shooting skills. Any fan of Westerns knows what that means. The hero fans the hammer of the revolver, quickly pulling the trigger repeatedly to take down a row of enemies. Linda Duffy claimed that once she started firing in this way, she couldn't stop and accidentally shot Patrick in the head. He had leaned forward at just the wrong moment, ending up directly in the line of fire. Her story was so incredible that it was hard to believe, yet at the same time, it seemed impossible to imagine her inventing it. The detectives listened to her account with a mixture of astonishment and skepticism. Detective Lauren didn't believe Linda, while his partner found the tale just crazy enough to be true. After the interview, they let Linda go home. There wasn't enough evidence to justify an arrest, but they wanted a clearer picture of how everything had unfolded. Their understanding deepened significantly once they received the medical examiner's report. The medical examiner found not 1 but 2 bullets in Patrick's head. The entry wounds were so close together that even seasoned officers hadn't noticed them initially. Linda claimed it was an accident, but she had shot her husband twice. This revelation planted doubts even in Detective McCarthy, who had initially believed her story. Still, he struggled to find a motive behind the crime. The Duffys seemed like a typical middle-class suburban family living near Los Angeles. Patrick had life insurance, but it had been taken out many years earlier. There was no evidence of infidelity either. Considering Linda's extreme eccentricity, McCarthy couldn't easily dismiss her version of events. Yet it became increasingly hard for him to believe her after speaking with Tracy Pock, a firearms expert brought into the investigation. Linda claimed she fired like the heroes in Westerns. This is indeed possible and relatively easy with the right firearm. The revolvers commonly used in Westerns are single action, meaning the shooter can pull the trigger and rapidly fan the hammer to fire multiple rounds in quick succession. The cylinder rotates with each pull, allowing the shooter to continue firing without interruption. Patrick Duffy owned 2 such revolvers, but the one Linda used that day was not among them. It was a double-action revolver, which requires significantly more effort to perform such a trick. To fire in a cowboy-style rapid sequence with a double-action revolver, a shooter must execute several actions in the correct order. Pull the trigger, release the hammer, fan the hammer, pull the trigger again, release the hammer, and fan the hammer, all at high speed, with little to no time for aiming. This made Linda's claim of an accidental shooting increasingly implausible. However, there was another issue. The deafening noise of the first gunshot and the weapon's recoil would likely have startled Linda. For someone unfamiliar with handling firearms, it would be nearly impossible to fire 2 shots so close together that the bullet holes were almost indistinguishable, let alone have them both strike Patrick's head in nearly the same spot. 2 years later, Linda Duffy was called back to the station and shown a video of firearms expert Tracy Peck demonstrating rapid fire with a revolver. Unexpectedly, Linda admitted that she needed to make a small correction to her story. She confessed that she and Patrick had been practicing cowboy-style shooting with unloaded guns for years, at least 15-20 times, she calmly told the stunned detectives. The detectives grew increasingly convinced that Linda's story had little to do with the truth. However, 2 major hurdles remain. 1, they still lacked conclusive evidence to definitively disprove her claims, and 2, they wanted to give her one last chance to demonstrate how the events of that day unfolded. They made her an unusual proposal: meet them at a shooting range where they would bring a replica of the revolver used in the incident and have her reenact her actions from that day. This plan was sound from every angle. Either Linda would prove her version of events, or the police would gain evidence that it was impossible for her to have shot Patrick accidentally. Confident she posed no further danger, the detectives let her go home to consider the offer. Days turned into weeks, then months, but Linda never responded to their proposal. In time, detectives Lauren and McCarthy were reassigned, and with new partners and fresh cases demanding their attention, old investigations began to fade into the background. Yet a few months later, the detectives found themselves back at the Duffy residence. They were puzzled by Linda's lack of response to their offer. Their surprise turned to outright astonishment when they arrived to find a for sale sign on the lawn. Linda's sons informed them that their mother had gone on a honeymoon to Italy. 1 year after Patrick's death, Linda Duffy became Linda Gwatz, having married Lorenz Gwatz, a world-class saxophonist who had performed at Carnegie Hall. She had met him online a year after Patrick's passing. Linda moved to Mississippi, where her new husband worked as a professor of music. She changed her appearance, dyed her hair, adopted a new style, and even took a job at the same university as Lawrence. The detectives could only shake their heads at the bizarre turn of events. Several years passed, and it seemed Linda must have thought everyone had forgotten about her. But Patrick's family could not let go of the lingering questions surrounding his death. While Linda had told police it was a tragic accident, she gave a very different story to Patrick's family later that same evening. According to them, Linda claimed that Patrick had accidentally shot himself. Patrick's sister and brother, Catherine Hunt, and her sibling, were skeptical from the start. They had grown up around firearms and adhered strictly to one cardinal rule: always unload your weapon before bringing it into the house. The next day at the funeral home, Linda confided in Catherine. Trembling and fearful of being hated, she spun another incredible version of the incident, describing it again as a freak accident. Despite her insistence, Patrick's family remained unconvinced, but they assumed the police had closed the case as an accident. It troubled them deeply that Linda had lied to them about the events of that day, but they had no means to challenge her story. Yet as time passed, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When they finally had the chance to revisit the case, Linda Duffy, or Linda Gwatz, was still on their minds. Detectives Lauren and McCarthy brought in a new expert, Paul Dolhauer, to examine the blood evidence from the crime scene. He reviewed the photos and police reports and concluded that Linda was lying. The woman claimed she had fired quickly and from the same spot. However, the blood spatter on her blouse in the wall told the expert a different story. According to her statements, the spatter appeared after the first shot, but for such patterns to form, the barrel would have had to be positioned 3 inches away from Patrick's head. The expert believed the second shot should have created a larger pool of blood on the floor, exactly where Linda claimed she had been standing. All that blood couldn't have avoided splashing onto her, yet she had only a few small drops on her. Police now believed that they had evidence proving Linda was lying. There was too little blood on her to support her story. The most likely scenario, according to investigators, was this. Patrick was asleep when his wife decided to commit the crime. She aimed and fired once, realized he was still alive, returned to the same position, aimed again, and fired a second time. This explained why the entry wounds were only 2 inches apart. The prosecutor decided to proceed with the case, and police spoke with Linda's colleagues. While they had always described her as charming, they now admitted they considered her a pathological liar. Even her close friend Julie said, "You either really liked Linda, or you realized you couldn't trust her. She always wanted to be the center of attention." This characterization was a revelation for the detectives and the district attorney, who concluded there was enough evidence to arrest Linda and charge her with the crime. 5 years after Patrick's death, Lieutenant McCarthy flew to Mississippi, where Linda was living with her new husband. For 2 weeks, members of the jury listened to incredible stories about Bugs Bunny, westerns, and testimony from experts on both sides who offered completely opposing interpretations of the events. It was too much for the jurors. They became deadlocked and could not reach a verdict, which meant a retrial would be necessary. The new trial began a year later, and Linda remained in jail during the interim. The battle between the prosecution and the defense was even fiercer this time. However, the prosecutor approached the case very differently. The main weakness of the prosecution's argument in the first trial was that, by all accounts, Linda and Patrick loved each other and were happy together. She had no obvious motive. This time, the prosecutor argued that Linda killed her husband because he was ill, and she feared having to care for him for the rest of his life. Additionally, the prosecutor decided not to show the jury interrogation videos in which Linda, sobbing uncontrollably, described her version of events to the police. By doing so, he effectively hamstrung the defense, which was barred from presenting those tapes themselves. As a result, the jury did not hear the story about Bugs Bunny, the couple's playful antics, or their cowboy-style shooting. Now, the only way for the jury to hear Linda's version of events was for her to testify and face cross-examination. This was exactly what the prosecutor was hoping for, but Linda was too afraid to take the stand. Her attorney found himself in a difficult position. He worried that without Linda's testimony, the jury would never hear about the fanfire shooting. However, he came up with a strategy. He discovered a reference to the shooting technique in Linda's 911 call, which had already been admitted as evidence by the prosecution. This allowed him to bring in a firearms expert who testified that fan-firing a revolver like the one Linda used was not particularly difficult. Thus, the jury never heard about Linda and Patrick imitating cartoon characters. Instead, they were shown a compelling animation created by the prosecutor's office, vividly illustrating the prosecution's version of the events. In the animation, Linda calmly approached her sleeping husband and shot him. The jury deliberated for less than a day and found Linda guilty of second-degree murder. Linda's sons and her second husband pleaded with the judge for leniency, but his hands were tied. The verdict required him to sentence her to a term ranging from 40 years to life in prison. After the trial, journalists interviewed jurors from both the first and second trials to understand why the first jury had been unable to reach a verdict, while the second found her guilty within a day. Ironically, the old adage, "less is more," proved true in this case. In the first trial, the jury struggled to understand Linda's motive and could not convict her because everything might have happened as she explained. In the second trial, the jury heard only the bare facts, leaving no room for sentimentality. This case was forgotten for 13 years. No one sought revenge, no one demanded justice, but one officer simply couldn't let it go. His instincts told him something wasn't right. That's what makes this case so compelling. We always want to believe in the triumph of justice, but sometimes it takes far longer than expected. And sometimes, solving a crime takes just one stubborn person who refuses to give up or back down. At 2:30 a.m. on February 28, 2000, the quiet of South Barrington, a suburb in Illinois, was shattered by the sound of ambulance and police sirens pulling up to the Buschauer family home. The 911 call had come from the head of the household, Frank Buschauer. Just 2 minutes after the call, young police officer Bryant Hanaszewski arrived at the scene, where Frank met him at the door, visibly panicked. He told the officer that his wife Cynthia had drowned. Frank led the officer through the bedroom and into the bathroom, where his wife lay face down on the floor. Her body had already gone into advanced rigor mortis, causing her legs to stiffen and lift slightly off the ground. Following protocol, Officer Hanaszewski checked her pulse. There was none. Her body was warm despite the rigor mortis, as she had been lying in hot water. There were visible livor mortis marks on her skin indicating she had remained face down for some time. At first glance, everything seemed to point to a tragic accident, a woman taking a bath who had likely slipped and fallen. But almost immediately, certain details began to raise questions in Officer Hanazowski's mind. Something didn't sit right. The officer spoke with Frank. He explained that he had gone to bed around 9 o'clock or 9:30 p.m. Around the same time, Cynthia had drawn herself a hot bath. He remembered hearing her run the water. Cynthia suffered from rheumatoid arthritis and would take scalding baths every day to help ease the pain. Frank drifted off to sleep, but around 2 a.m., he was awakened by the cries of their 1-year-old son, David. Frank got out of bed and found that Cynthia was still in the bathtub. She wasn't moving, and she was clearly dead. Frank said he pulled her out of the tub and laid her on the floor. Then he called emergency services. He also said he covered her naked body with a red sweater. But Officer Hanazowski couldn't help but notice something strange. Frank's pajama pants and shirt were completely dry. If he had pulled his wife's body from the water, how had he done it without getting wet? Frank added that Cynthia had recently been sick, and he believed the hot water might have worsened her condition, causing her to lose consciousness and drown. The investigator who arrived at the scene examined the bathroom to confirm or refute Frank's account. Indeed, he noticed some medicine near the sink, which supported Frank's statement that Cynthia had been feeling unwell. However, he was puzzled that all the bath products and drinking water bottles were still in place. If Frank had pulled his wife out of the tub, they would likely have been knocked over. In addition, there was no water on the floor around the tub. That seemed a bit unusual. Meanwhile, Cynthia's body was taken to Chicago for an autopsy, where the medical examiner discovered injuries that he couldn't fully explain. For example, there were fresh scratches on her knuckles, knee, and nose. He also noted deep hemorrhaging around her neck. The examiner suggested that the scratches could have occurred when Frank pulled Cynthia out of the bathtub and laid her on the floor. At the same time, her lungs were filled with water, which confirmed that she had drowned. Of course, the toxicology report was still pending, but the pathologist suggested that the drowning might have been caused by some medical condition that led to a sudden loss of motor function. Overall, the autopsy findings were consistent with Frank's account. The pathologist concluded that the cause of death was drowning. However, due to the unexplained injuries, he couldn't determine with certainty whether Cynthia's death was the result of an accident or something far more disturbing. On March 6, Frank was invited to the station because the police wanted to clarify a few details. Frank came across as a very quiet, calm, and pleasant man. He essentially repeated the same story he had told the officers on the night of his wife's death. Recalling the medical examiner's suggestion that some of Cynthia's scratches and bruises might have occurred when Frank pulled her from the bathtub, the detectives wanted to hear every detail of that night. But Frank said he had no explanation for the injuries on her body. When a wife dies, the police's first priority is to determine whether the husband had any motive to want her dead. Perhaps Cynthia had life insurance. Frank denied that he stood to gain anything financially from her death. When asked how he had managed to pull his wife out of the tub without getting his clothes wet, he hesitated and then said he must have changed clothes before the emergency responders arrived. But Officer Hanazowski had arrived just 2 minutes after the 911 call. Believing there were still some unanswered questions, the police asked Frank for permission to search his home. He did not object. During the search, officers found a stack of letters in a prominent spot in the kitchen, letters that Frank and Cynthia had written to each other. After reading them, it became clear that their marriage was far from ideal. Frank openly admitted that they had been going through difficulties, and their pastor, who also acted as their marriage counselor, had suggested that Cynthia write Frank a letter listing all her grievances, and that Frank respond in writing as well. Naturally, the letters contained a great deal of personal and intimate information about the couple's relationship, which the detectives now had access to. The letters were filled with mutual accusations, but now, in light of Cynthia's death, those accusations began to sound like potential motives. One line in particular stood out to investigators. Frank had written, "If we can't resolve conflict constructively, then divorce is better than abuse or murder." Frank explained that their pastor had given them a book which described abuse and murder as the worst possible outcomes in a marriage, and that he had encouraged the use of strong wording to make the point. The detectives were skeptical of Frank's explanation, but he provided the names of another couple who had also attended therapy and urged the police to speak with them. Additionally, the officers were puzzled by the fact that Frank had left the letters in such a visible place in the house. But what had caused such deep conflict that reconciliation no longer seemed possible? Surprisingly, all of their problems revolved around the new beautiful house they had built just a year earlier, and only recently moved into. The core of the dispute was that they had hired a construction company owned by Frank's cousin. Whether due to the cousin's lack of experience or some other reason, the house had been built with several code violations. It had numerous ongoing issues. Windows and doors wouldn't open properly, and there were leaks in some areas. On top of that, the couple had significantly exceeded their original construction budget. The cousin demanded $200,000 more than what had initially been agreed upon. Cynthia was unwilling to accept this. She wanted to take Frank's cousin to court, but Frank loved his cousin and couldn't bear the thought of him facing financial ruin. He feared it might lead to bankruptcy. Since they couldn't resolve the issue, the arguments between husband and wife never stopped. To clarify the situation at home, Frank spent 11 hours at the police station, patiently answering all questions, even the most personal ones. By the time he finished, it was already dark. Frank was not arrested and was allowed to go home, but was asked to return the next day. However, the next morning, Frank arrived at the station with his sister and announced that he would not speak to the police without a lawyer present. It was clear that when he returned home, his sister had asked him about his conversation with the police and realized that the investigators were not convinced Cynthia's death was an accident. That's why she insisted he not talk to them without an attorney. The police began verifying the statements Frank had already given. They met with the couple whose names Frank had mentioned. The investigators were quite surprised when the couple confirmed that their pastor and marriage counselor had encouraged not only writing letters, but also using words like abuse and murder, which they had seen in Frank's letter. Additionally, the couple stated that they had seen no signs of any serious problems in Frank and Cynthia's marriage. As for Cynthia's relatives, her mother told investigators more about her daughter's life and marriage. She explained that Cynthia had suffered from arthritis for most of her life, and when she was younger, had to use a wheelchair. To help herself, and possibly others, she earned a degree in nutrition and dietetics. Cynthia followed a holistic approach to maintaining her health and took very hot baths. Thanks to this care and approach, she managed to get out of the wheelchair. By the time Frank Buschauer met Cynthia Hrisco, he was about 50 years old. Cynthia was 4 years younger. Frank worked as a petrochemical engineer at an oil company. He traveled frequently and earned a good income, but he was now ready to settle down in the Chicago area. The future spouses started communicating online in the 1990s, when dating websites were still in their infancy. Cynthia and Frank married in 1996. They wanted children, but Cynthia's health issues prevented her from conceiving, so they decided to adopt. Their son was born in Russia in 1999, and when he was only 10 months old, Frank and Cynthia completed all the paperwork, brought him home, and moved to Illinois. The couple also planned to adopt a daughter, but never got the chance. For their growing family, they decided to build a house and hired Frank's cousin's construction company. By 2000, they were settling into their new home, worth around $1 million. Specifically for her traditional bathing treatments, Cynthia had the workers set the hot water heater temperature higher than in most other homes. The water temperature could exceed 60 degrees Celsius. For many people, 41 degrees Celsius is considered the dangerous limit, but Cynthia believed in the healing effects of such water treatments. Cynthia's care for her health was yielding remarkable results. On April 20th, 2000, 2 months after her death, the toxicology report arrived. It showed that, aside from her arthritis, 47-year-old Cynthia was an exceptionally healthy woman. All her organs were in perfect condition. The pills found in the bathroom were homeopathic remedies and had no relation to her death. In other words, there was no medical explanation for why she might have lost consciousness in the bathtub. Nevertheless, Cynthia's family members knew that she sometimes fainted and experienced dizzy spells while lying in hot water. Therefore, the hypothesis that she lost consciousness and accidentally drowned seemed quite plausible. In other words, what happened could indeed have been a tragic accident. Although the police couldn't answer every question about the case, they had no evidence to convince a jury otherwise. Unexpectedly, they learned another interesting detail. The funeral home owner called and informed them that an insurance company had contacted her regarding a policy on Cynthia Hrisco. It turned out that Cynthia had a $45,000 insurance policy, but the payout was to go not to Frank, but to Cynthia's mother. Therefore, financial motive could not have been a reason for murdering her. The police had neither motive nor evidence to support the idea of murder. Although Cynthia's relatives, as well as the police, were concerned about the bruises on her body, there was no basis to continue the investigation. The case was closed. Frank Buschauer and his son David moved to Wisconsin, to Frank's childhood home. At first, Frank was confused and admitted to his sister that he had no idea how he would raise his 1-year-old son alone. The night Cynthia died was the worst night of his life, but he had to pull himself together, at least for David's sake. Frank devoted a lot of time to his son. They fished together, rode bikes, camped outdoors. He never missed a chance to tell David about his mother. In fact, everything David knows about his mother, he learned from his father, who always spoke of his late wife with tenderness and respect. David believes his father did everything possible to give him a happy childhood. At the same time, Officer Bryant Hanaszewski, who was the first to arrive at the Buschauer family home that fateful night, was dissatisfied. He felt that something about the case didn't add up. 10 years passed before Officer Hanaszewski was promoted to detective, and he began thinking again about the case that had haunted him all those years. He obtained permission to work on it and started by re-examining the scene where Cynthia died. The new owners of the house allowed the detective to inspect the bathtub, which had remained completely unchanged for 10 years. This seemed incredible until they learned that the new homeowner had never used it or even filled it with water because the bathtub was leaking. However, it had been preserved in the exact same condition as at the time of Cynthia's death, which was perfect for the investigation. Therefore, the detective requested permission to bring in forensic experts to examine the bathtub. The detective spoke with Cynthia's friends and members of the family therapy group, whom the investigators hadn't talked to back in 2000. He found out that the atmosphere in the family was much worse than it had seemed at first. And of course, the reason was the house. For almost a year, Cynthia had been constantly criticizing her husband. She complained to friends that the marriage was headed for divorce and that Frank hated her. One family acquaintance revealed that during one argument, usually quiet and calm, Frank lost his temper, put his hands around Cynthia's neck, and threatened to kill her if she didn't stop complaining about the house. According to some acquaintances who described Cynthia as materialistic, arrogant, formal, and controlling, she was unlikely to stay silent, give up her complaints, or try to find common ground with her husband. Considering that Cynthia had been obsessed with the house for a whole year they lived there, the detective believed that Frank might have killed his wife in a fit of rage. Detective Hanaszewski contacted Andrea Zafaris, an expert on deaths related to water. She reviewed the case files and was also puzzled by the small scratches all over Cynthia's body. Andrea agreed to participate in a reconstruction, but only if the bathtub could be filled with water. The detective persuaded the homeowner to allow them to remove the bathtub. The police hired a carpenter to build a wooden frame identical to the one in the family's house. Then, using photos taken at the scene of Cynthia's death, they arranged the items exactly as they had been. They began reconstructing the incident with actors playing the roles of Cynthia and Frank. First and foremost, they tried to answer whether it was possible to pull Cynthia out of the bathtub without knocking things onto the floor. In principle, it was possible, but it required very careful movements, and the situation didn't allow for that. After all, discovering his wife in the middle of the night, still submerged underwater, Frank would have behaved more like a bull in a china shop. What kind of carefulness could there be? Additionally, the police wanted to know if Frank could have taken Cynthia out of the water without getting his clothes and the floor wet. They reenacted the scene several times, and every time the actor playing Frank got wet. Finally, they explored the possibility that a murder had occurred. They hypothesized that Frank held Cynthia underwater until she drowned. Andrea Zafaris wanted the actors to reenact this scene, but they were too careful and couldn't achieve the results she expected. So Andrea put on a swimsuit and got into the water herself. The role of Frank was played by Detective Hanaszewski. The detective held Andrea underwater, head down, pressing on her neck, while she struggled, tried to lift her head, and struck the sides of the tub with her hands and feet. As a result, Andrea got scratches on her knee and knuckles because they were pressed by her own weight. Additionally, she had a fresh scratch on her nose because her face was pressed against the whirlpool jet hole of the bathtub. It also became clear that the hemorrhage on Cynthia's neck was caused by her efforts to lift her head and take a breath, which Frank prevented. The investigators shared the reconstruction results with the medical examiner, who then changed the cause of death to homicide. Cause of death: Cynthia was forcibly submerged in the bathtub. The prosecutor believed there was enough evidence to charge Frank. The detective was issued an arrest warrant for him. On April 24, 2013, almost 13 years after Cynthia's death, Detective Hanaszewski traveled to Wisconsin, where Frank lived with his son and worked at the Christian Youth Association. The detective met Frank at his workplace and asked him to come to the station, informing him that he had come regarding his wife. At the station, they began discussing the events of that terrible night again, as well as the couple's relationship. Frank answered questions openly and did not ask for a lawyer, something he would surely regret many times later. He did not confess to the murder, but the things he said were quite incriminating. Frank did not deny that he regretted marrying Cynthia because she loved money more than she loved him. For an entire year, she constantly brought up the topic of the house, which infuriated her husband. During the conversation with the detectives, the man readily agreed that the police had reason to consider him guilty of murder. He himself would have concluded it was murder. For Detective Hanazowski, that was enough. He informed the man that there was already a warrant for his arrest. Frank Buschauer was charged with first-degree murder. The trial began only 6 years later. The prosecutor wanted to make sure she had prepared a solid case against Frank before going to court. Frank Buschauer preferred that the judge, rather than a jury, decide whether he was guilty. He probably thought the judge would be more impartial compared to a jury and would determine that there was objectively insufficient evidence against him. However, the judge reviewed the conversation with Frank at the station and, among other things, was likely convinced of the man's guilt. The judge said that Frank made a tentative step toward confession, and the video shows the torment of a guilty mind. He found the man guilty and sentenced him to 25 years in prison. Considering that Frank was already 70 years old at that time, it was effectively a life sentence. His family wasn't even allowed to hug him. He was taken away in handcuffs. He only managed to turn to his son and silently say with his lips that he loved him. Of course, Frank filed an appeal. He is supported by his now adult son, David, his sister, as well as their pastor and several friends. None of them believed that Frank committed the crime. He had never been arrested before, never shown cruelty to anyone. After his wife's death, he kept away from trouble. All these years he worked, raised his son, and constantly told David how much his mother loved him. It is clear that David cannot accept the verdict and does not want those who, in his opinion, convicted an innocent man to get away with it. The police and prosecution, on the other hand, are convinced that the guilty man is behind bars. They believe that after his wife's murder, Frank was torn by conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he wanted to confess because that would have allowed him to openly talk about how terribly and irrationally his wife behaved, how she was the one who was difficult, couldn't forgive him over the house situation, and wanted to go to court. But on the other hand, Frank did not want to go to prison. He made strange statements, as if admitting guilt, but in a way that would not have legal consequences. This case reminds us that everyone has their own point of view. Investigators, experts, Frank, David, all looked at what happened through the prism of their own beliefs about life and justice. The detective believed he had to seek justice for Cynthia's family and for the law. David is certain that the father he has known all his life, who never broke the law, could not have committed the crime, and that it was unfair to take him away from the family after 13 years. Frank's friends suggest that after Cynthia's death, strong whirlpool currents pushed her body from wall to wall, causing the scratches and bruises, and that her husband had absolutely nothing to do with it. Even in the seemingly simplest case, there are so many layers and uncertainties. There will always be unanswered questions, and even knowing the verdict, we may never know the whole truth. But it is so sad to realize that people can suffer not only after the death of a loved one, but also after justice is served for a committed crime. On a warm late April evening, a 50-year-old woman, let's call her Maria, went out on an errand, not realizing how that night would end for her. Aware that it was already quite late, Maria stayed alert. Her watchful eye did not miss a young man in a bright jacket with red and white stripes, who had clearly noticed her and began following her from the opposite side of the street. Maria hurriedly dialed the emergency services number. She asked the operator for help, explaining that she was being followed by a stranger. While staying on the line with the operator, the woman crossed the street and picked up a stone from the ground. Clearly not a timid person, Maria confronted the young man directly, demanding to know what he wanted and why he was following her. Moments later, the operator heard a sharp exclamation, a woman's scream, and then the sounds of a struggle. The operator did not yet know it, but at that very moment, the man dragged Maria onto a vacant lot. The dispatcher tried to encourage her, saying that help was already on the way. But sounds coming through the receiver left no doubt about what was happening. The man was committing violent acts against Maria. The operator then dispatched every available unit to help the woman. Not only patrol officers, but also canine units with dogs and even a helicopter. All of them rushed to the specified area, trying to locate the victim and her attacker. Meanwhile, Maria, still clutching the stone in her hand, twisted free and struck her assailant on the head and face. His blood splattered onto her jacket. The sound of sirens was rapidly approaching. The attacker's head was bleeding, and he realized he needed to flee if he did not want to end up in prison. On Monday, April 16, 2012, 9-year-old Christopher Martinez entered the school building in Las Vegas, Nevada, where he was a student. Christopher's face was wet with tears, and his teacher asked him what had happened. The boy shocked her by saying that his mother and sister were dead and that his father was wandering around the house covered in blood. Christopher added that his 4-year-old brother, Alejandro, had been left at home with their father. The teacher reported the boy's statement to the school officer, who then called the police. When the first officers arrived, they took Christopher back home. On the way, the boy explained that his family consisted of his father, Arturo Martinez, his mother, Yadi, his 10-year-old sister Carla, himself, and his youngest brother, 4-year-old Alejandro. Upon arriving, the officers cautiously looked into the house through a window and saw that the walls, floors, and furniture were splattered with blood. Amid this horrific scene, a child about 4 years old was wandering around. The police tried to coax the child outside, but at that very moment, the front door flew open and a man appeared in the doorway. Based on Christopher's description, the officers were facing 39-year-old Arturo Martinez, the father of the family. He was covered in blood, mostly dried. He looked confused, as if he did not understand where he was or what was happening. However, the officers could not know whether he was pretending. They ordered him to stop and show his hands, but the man did not respond to either their commands or their questions. The officers had no idea what the man intended to do. Why was he refusing to answer? Was he afraid of incriminating himself and decided to remain silent? After all, if the boy was not mistaken, his mother and sister were dead, while the father was alive, covered in dried blood and behaving irrationally. The police had no choice but to treat Arturo as a suspect. He was not taken to the station immediately only because he had injuries. Accompanied by an officer, he was transported to the nearest hospital. The police placed little Alejandro in the car with his older brother. There, the children were safe while detectives entered and searched the house. At that point, the police knew what they were dealing with only from the words of a child. There were no signs of forced entry on the door, but beyond the door, a true nightmare awaited them. Blood was everywhere. There was an enormous amount of it, and the attack had not been confined to a single room. Arturo's wife and the children's mother, 38-year-old Ignacia Yadira Martinez, known simply as Yadi, was lying on the floor near the bedroom door. Yadi was partially unclothed. She was wearing nothing below the waist. Investigators believed that Yadi had been sexually assaulted. She had been killed by multiple blows to the head with a blunt object. Because Yadi was found near the doorway and blood spatter was present on the headboard of the bed, detectives concluded that the attack began while she was lying in bed. After the first blow, blood pooled around her head, and after the second, it sprayed outward, reaching the headboard. This indicated that the victim had been struck at least twice before being dragged off the bed. This conclusion was supported by drag marks and finger impressions found on Yadi's ankles. The perpetrator clearly did not seem particularly concerned about being arrested. He left behind numerous fingerprints, including even a palm print on the floor between the victim's legs. In one of the children's bedrooms at the other end of the house lay the body of Yadi and Arturo's daughter, 10-year-old Carla Martinez. Apparently, the girl had suffered the same fate as her mother. The bodies of both victims were transported for autopsy. It appeared that this was not a robbery, as all valuables were still in place. On the contrary, officers found something in Arturo's pickup truck that should not have been there. The vehicle was parked in the driveway, and in the open truck bed, officers discovered a lightweight jacket with white and red stripes. It was relatively clean, with no traces of dirt or dust, indicating that it had been placed there quite recently. Detectives showed the jacket to Christopher and asked whether he knew who it belonged to. The boy answered that he did not. However, there was blood on the jacket, and it was logged into evidence. The officers then began gathering information. They started with the neighbors who had gathered outside, confused about what could have happened during the night and why half the neighborhood had been cordoned off with yellow tape. Since the police were treating Arturo as a suspect, they questioned neighbors and family friends about the relationship between the spouses. Everyone, however, unanimously stated that Arturo and Yadi got along very well. They worked hard, attended church, and raised their children. Yadi had always dreamed of becoming a lawyer. She earned her degree, but around the same time she met Arturo, and the two moved together to Nevada. Overall, it was a fairly ordinary story. The couple came from Mexico to the United States in search of better opportunities. And because they were willing to work hard for that future, everything seemed to be going well for them. Arturo worked in construction, became an electrician, and had a good job with a stable income. Yadi also worked hard while raising the children. The couple bought a house. Together, they opened a boxing gym, something Arturo had long dreamed of. They instilled a strong work ethic in their children as well. Their 10-year-old daughter, Carla, or Carlita, practiced gymnastics and won competitions. Christopher did well in school and was described as a wonderful, well-mannered, and talented boy. The youngest child, Alejandro, was only 4 years old, and it was too early to speak of his abilities. In any case, according to neighbors, relatives, and friends, the family had no problems. On the other hand, who can truly know what happens behind closed doors, especially since the police found no signs of forced entry? In such cases, the perpetrator is usually someone the family knows or someone who was already inside the home. In other words, Arturo was becoming increasingly suspicious. Because Arturo stubbornly refused to answer questions, detectives began to believe that the murders of Yadi and Carla were the result of domestic violence. And if not for Christopher, who had the presence of mind to go to school and tell his teacher what had happened, it is unknown how long the truth about this horrific incident might have remained hidden. Christopher told investigators that the Saturday to Sunday evening had gone exactly as usual. The whole family went out to watch a boxing match. Since Arturo had drunk a little beer, Yadi took the wheel on the way back. The family returned home quite late. Everyone went to their rooms. Carla went to hers, and Christopher went into the room he shared with his younger brother. Shortly afterward, their mother came in, wished the children sweet dreams, and gently kissed them on the forehead. The children fell asleep. When Christopher woke up on Sunday morning and stepped out of the room, he could not believe his eyes. His father, covered in blood, was standing over Yadi's body. Christopher froze in shock. He saw that his mother was not moving and realized that she was dead. For a moment, he wondered whether his father might have done something to her. He asked him what had happened. The man looked at his son with tear-filled eyes, but could not bring himself to say a single word. Christopher noticed blood on his father's head and face and decided that he was injured. He thought he should find his older sister, likely hoping she would know what to do. The boy ran to her room, but found Carla lying on the floor in a pool of her own blood. Horrified, Christopher left the room and tried to find a phone to call 911, but he could not find one. He returned to his own room, to his younger brother. He lay down on the bed and burst into tears. He was in shock, but he knew he had to take care of Alejandro. After some time, his father entered their room. Christopher washed the blood from his father's hands. For most of Sunday, the man drifted in and out of consciousness. As soon as Monday morning arrived, Christopher got himself together and hurried to school, hoping someone there would help him. Before leaving, he told Alejandro to stay inside the house and strictly forbade him from going outside. Later that same day, Monday afternoon, the detective who had accompanied Arturo to the hospital finally learned why the man had refused to speak to the police. A doctor explained that Arturo had suffered 3 horrific blows to the head, most likely from a hammer. One of the strikes was so powerful that the hammer penetrated his skull all the way to the handle. The blow landed above the brainstem. By sheer luck, his brain was not crushed. As a result, Arturo developed aphasia, a loss of speech. In other words, he was not pretending. He truly could not utter a single word. It was absolutely certain that he could not have inflicted these injuries on himself in order to deflect suspicion. Delivering such blows would have required a full swing, pulling the arm back, which would have been impossible given the angles at which the man had been struck. Moreover, a hammer would not have penetrated the skull that deeply. But how did he survive such an attack? The explanation was that a powerful blow and heavy bleeding normally cause intracranial pressure, which could have killed him. However, the attacker struck him so violently that 2 open wounds, essentially 2 holes, were left in his skull. This, in effect, relieved the intracranial pressure. Of course, the killer did not plan this. It was a miracle that Arturo survived and managed to last an entire day before being taken to the hospital. Given the large amount of blood left on the couch in the family's living room, investigators concluded that Arturo lay down on the couch when the family returned home on Saturday evening. Most likely, he fell asleep, especially since he had drunk some beer. The attacker cruelly took advantage of his defenseless state and struck the man twice on the left side, followed by the most devastating blow to the center of the back of his head. There was so much blood throughout the house because Arturo did not die. Instead, he wandered around in a dazed state. Due to aphasia, he was unable to speak and, of course, could not call for help. Thus, the rapist and murderer first attacked the man, the head of the household, who could have offered serious resistance. And when he believed he had killed Arturo, he turned his attention to the woman and the girl. For some reason, the killer did not harm the boys. Perhaps he did not know of their existence, or perhaps he simply chose not to kill them. Without delay, the medical examiner performed the autopsy and confirmed what the police already knew. Yadi had been struck on the head twice. The murder weapon, most likely a hammer, had penetrated her skull deeply, passing through the bone upon impact. Carla had also been beaten with a hammer. In addition, both victims, the mother and the daughter, had been sexually assaulted. DNA from an unknown individual was found in their bodies. This meant that once a suspect emerged, their DNA could be compared with the samples collected from the crime scene. For 2 days, the police worked tirelessly searching for leads. They learned that at the boxing gym, Arturo had a trainer with whom he had parted ways amid a scandal the previous November. Arturo had been forced to call the police to remove the trainer he had just fired. In a rage, the trainer had threatened to kill Arturo and his entire family. The police could not ignore such a threat and began looking for this individual. Fortunately, the officers who had removed the trainer from the gym recalled that his name was Salvador, and his nickname sounded like El Chapo, but they could not provide any further assistance. Records of Arturo's employees contained no additional information. However, a witness revealed to the detectives that the trainer had died in Mexico shortly after the confrontation with Arturo. It had seemed like a promising lead, but unfortunately, it went nowhere. The police had no leads to continue the investigation. Therefore, they were eager to find the murder weapon. They searched for it for 3 days. Judging by the fingerprints and DNA the killer had left behind, he had not made much effort to conceal his identity. This meant he could have discarded the hammer somewhere nearby. The officers first focused on searching every room in the house. They then expanded the search to the surrounding area. One of the officers climbed onto the cinder block wall surrounding the house. At the northern gate, he noticed blood. Since the cinder blocks had hollow cavities, the officer examined the wall and discovered a blood-stained hammer inside one of the cavities. While examining the area around the house, the officers also noticed a dusty trash bin, but the dust covered it unevenly. It looked as though someone had stepped on it to climb over the wall. What was especially curious was that both the dusty trash bin and the hammer were located along the boundary between the Martinez family's property and that of their neighbors, with whom, by an interesting coincidence, they had long-standing conflicts. The police decided to investigate whether the neighbors could have been involved in the murders. Obviously, as often happens, the conflict had started over a minor issue, but it escalated on the night from Saturday to Sunday, practically at the time of the killings. Witnesses reported hearing an argument unfold right in front of the Martinez house. The story was that late on Saturday night, when the family returned home, a neighbor's car was parked in their driveway, preventing Yadi from pulling in. Yadi entered the house with the children, while Arturo went to the neighbor's door to ask them to move the car, or perhaps not ask but demand, because the details of the conversation are unclear. Later, when the neighbor finally came out to move the car, he discovered a flat tire. Naturally, all the blame fell on Arturo. The neighbors argued again, raising their voices in a dispute that other neighbors could hear. Here's the most interesting part. The argument happened at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the family was attacked at 4, just 2 hours later. Considering the timing and the bloody trail leading to the Martinez house, detectives initially suspected that a neighbor, in a fit of rage, had attacked the family. This assumption matched the evidence at the crime scene, which suggested that the killer had acted without planning, was disorganized, and had simply attacked the first victims he encountered with whatever weapon was at hand. The investigators knocked on the neighbor's door. They readily confirmed that they had a long-standing conflict with Arturo, but nothing serious enough to justify murder. The detectives did not expect them to confess so easily. They conducted a search of the neighbor's house and collected their fingerprints and DNA. These needed to be compared with the fingerprints and DNA found at the crime scene. The problem was that comparing DNA samples is a relatively lengthy process. To avoid losing time, the investigators examined other possible leads and discovered that on the same Saturday to Sunday night, just before the unknown intruder broke into the Martinez family home, another daring sexual assault had occurred less than a kilometer away. The police took interest in this because even in such a large city, the coincidence seemed too striking to ignore. Late at night on a deserted street less than a kilometer from the Martinez family home, a 50-year-old woman was walking. Her real name has not been disclosed, so we will call her Maria. She was heading in the direction of the Martinez residence. Since she was passing by a vacant lot in the middle of the night, Maria moved cautiously and occasionally looked around. She noticed a man on the opposite side of the street who began following her. Maria called emergency services and asked for help. The operator dispatched a patrol car, but unfortunately, the officers did not arrive in time. The man dragged Maria into the vacant lot and began undressing her. Since the dispatcher remained on the line, she heard the brutal attack unfolding and immediately called in helicopters, K-9 units, and all available patrol officers. The sound of sirens startled the assailant, preventing him from completing the attack and leaving his DNA behind. Fortunately, Maria managed to pick up a stone, twist free, and strike the perpetrator on the head with full force. Blood sprayed into her jacket. The attacker was wounded, heard the approaching patrol sirens, and realized he needed to flee. He grabbed the victim's phone and ran, heading toward Arturo and Yadi's house. He was fleeing the police and helicopters and needed to hide somewhere. Investigators quickly reviewed surveillance footage capturing the unknown suspect. He was wearing a light, bright jacket with red and white stripes, the same jacket found in the open bed of Arturo's pickup. This was a major lead. The suspect was also wearing a baseball cap, which likely fell off when Maria struck him with a stone. Investigators concluded that the attack on Maria, less than a kilometer from the Martinez home, was only the beginning. Incensed but unable to finish what he had started, the perpetrator did not simply wait in some yard for the police to leave. He entered the first house he could find, attempted to kill Arturo, attacked the mother and daughter, and ultimately killed them. Forensic specialists quickly collected a DNA sample from Maria's jacket to identify her assailant. It should not be forgotten that the suspect, for some reason, took the victim's phone and, even more surprisingly, used it. After Maria had contacted emergency services, 3 more calls were made from her phone. Of course, they were not made by her. The perpetrator in particular contacted a man named Gary Harris. Gary works at a local casino. He recalled that on that night, he had indeed received a call from a childhood friend known by the nickname Junior, but whose real name is Brian Clay. He was 22 years old. Brian did not have a long criminal record, but one incident in his past revealed something about his character. His girlfriend had become pregnant and was expecting his child. When he found out, Brian pushed her to the floor and kicked her in the stomach, attempting to provoke a miscarriage. While assaulting her, he shouted at her to make it clear that he did not want the child. This incident made Brian the prime suspect in the murder of Yadi and Carla. The problem was locating him. On the 27th, however, his mother, fearing that her son might be involved in the crime, called the police and reported that he was hiding at her home. Thus, 11 days after the start of the investigation, detectives arrested Brian at his mother's house. During interrogation, Brian attempted to rely on a lapse in memory. He claimed that he had been drinking and possibly using illegal substances that night, and therefore remembered nothing. But this was, of course, a lie. At the very least, when he attacked Maria and heard the police sirens, he realized he needed to flee. After the murders of Carla and Yadi and the attack on Arturo, he had the presence of mind to climb the cinder block wall and hide the hammer inside one of the blocks. In other words, he was not so intoxicated that he forgot to hide the murder weapon. Detectives showed the young man photographs and reminded him of what he had done to Yadi and Carla, but not a trace of remorse crossed Brian's face. He admitted to nothing. Fortunately, the results of the DNA comparisons arrived in time. The DNA from both crime scenes matched Brian. He was arrested and, in addition, charged with multiple acts of violence, assault, and 2 murders. He remained in custody, but did not face trial for several years, as his attorneys delayed proceedings by filing various motions and petitions. All of these requests were denied. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and Brian Clay was ultimately found guilty. However, the jury did not have the heart to impose the death penalty. On December 5, 2017, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Not all family members agreed with this decision. They could not understand what else Brian Clay would have had to do to receive a death sentence. In any case, executions had not been carried out in Nevada since 2006, so the practical outcome would have been the same. Brian Clay will spend the rest of his life in prison. As for Arturo Martinez, he managed to recover from the horrific attack. He returned to work as an electrician and began a new chapter in life by remarrying. His heart still carries the pain of loss, but as a devout Catholic, he found the strength to forgive Brian. Christopher, though burdened by heavy memories, decided to move forward. In May 2022, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy to protect others and help prevent tragedies from happening again. The memory of his mother and sister lives on in his heart, and their love and support have become his guiding compass in life.
The camera slowly pulls back to reveal, in all its glory, the brand new kitchen of Bill and Belinda Pulver, a true architectural masterpiece located in Sydney's prestigious suburb of Mosman. The modern mansion was built on the foundation of the Pulver family's old home and captivates with its seemingly floating concrete walls. Enormous floor-to-ceiling windows offer breathtaking views over Taylor's Bay. Angus Pulver, the couple's son, returns home from training, and Belinda offers him something to eat while his parents showcase the home's new design for sandcastles, a television program about architecture and design. But just one day after the television crew packed up their cameras and left, the upstairs kitchen and living room became the scene of a crime unlike anything in modern Australian history. Madeline Pulver, the couple's 18-year-old daughter, was sitting in the kitchen, taking a short break from studying for her final HSC exams, when an intruder entered the mansion. He placed an explosive collar around the teenager's neck and demanded a ransom for her life. On the afternoon of Wednesday, August 3rd, 2011, Madeline, or Maddie, Pulver was home alone. Her father was at work, her mother was out shopping, her two younger brothers were at school, and her older brother was away on vacation. With only a few months of school remaining, Maddie took advantage of the quiet and solitude in the house to focus on exam preparation. But shortly after 2 p.m., she was abruptly interrupted. Hearing a faint noise, the girl turned around and saw a man entering the kitchen. He was wearing a ski mask that covered his entire face except for his eyes. It wasn't an ordinary mask. It was brightly striped and featured a smiling mouth. It would have been less frightening if it had been plain black. The mask terrified Maddie, perhaps even more than the black aluminum baseball bat the stranger was carrying. She jumped to her feet and backed away from him. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said. Maddie asked what he wanted and what he was doing in her house. The man led her into the living room, told her to sit down, and promised that if she obeyed, nobody would get hurt. Maddie could hardly believe what was happening. She was frightened and had no idea what this stranger intended to do to her, but she remained calm enough to study him carefully and remember several important details. He was wearing beige trousers and a blue office shirt, clothing more suited to desk work than breaking into someone's home. He still had the ski mask on, but Maddie remembered his eyes through the openings in the balaclava. His eyes looked tired and dull, and the skin around them was lined with fine wrinkles. She estimated that he might have been around 50 years old, perhaps slightly older. Meanwhile, the stranger took a small black backpack he had brought with him and removed a rectangular box. It was about the size of an iPad and several centimeters thick. He pulled out a chain resembling a bicycle lock and used it to secure the box around Maddie's neck. Then he placed a purple cord around her neck with a note attached to it. After finishing, the man ordered Maddie to count to 200 before calling for help. He told her he was nearby and watching her and warned that disobedience would have consequences. Then the man, who was later found to have simply entered through an unlocked door, fled. But Maddie didn't know that. Believing he could still be hiding somewhere inside the 3-story house or in the garden, she obediently began counting. After reaching 200, she tried shouting, but nobody heard her. Moving as carefully as possible, she found a phone and called her father, telling him she had become a hostage in her own home and that he needed to call the police. Only after that did she unfold the note hanging from the cord around her neck. To her shock and horror, it turned out to be a 2-page letter in which the stranger explicitly forbade contacting the police. But by then, she had already asked her father to call them. She had no idea what the note contained, and her instinct had simply been to reach out to her parents. Realizing she had disobeyed the criminal only intensified her panic. When police arrived at the house, they were stunned by what they saw. It appeared that the device around the girl's neck was a real bomb collar, and the purple cord carried a ransom demand. Never before in modern Australian history had police dealt with a crime like this. Their first priority was to evacuate neighboring homes and close the road leading past the family mansion. Once such a massive police presence converged on one neighborhood, evacuating residents and closing roads, it became impossible to keep the situation hidden from journalists for long. 2 terrifying words, bomb collar, immediately appeared in news headlines around the world. At first, however, reporters knew almost nothing beyond the fact that the hostage was a high school senior preparing for an important graduation exam. Speculation quickly spread that Maddie had staged the whole thing herself with the help of a friend, and that the bomb threat had been her own idea. But once the shocking details emerged, nobody doubted any longer that the situation was deadly serious and that human lives were at stake. Not to mention, things like this simply do not happen in Australia. The country and much of the world followed the unfolding events. Some journalists covering the case compared it to a Hollywood movie, but for the family involved, this was reality. And so were the bomber's demands. In a rather unusual 2-page letter, he wrote, "A small portable case secured with a combination lock has been delivered to you. Inside it is a powerful advanced plastic explosive compound. The case is protected by an anti-tamper mechanism. It can only be opened safely by following instructions. To remove any doubt, I am a former military ordnance specialist from the United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, and I have been constructing devices of this nature for more than 20 years. Therefore, action first, questions later. Otherwise, you may unintentionally trigger a tragic and preventable explosion known within the U.S. military as the death of Brian Douglas Wells. Under no circumstances attempt to cut any wires leading to the device. Under no circumstances attempt to open the case. Under no circumstances press any of the 4 buttons more than 3 consecutive times. Do not expose the case to excessive moisture. Under no circumstances heat, cool, or X-ray the device. Do not ask anyone to help open it. Any violation will immediately result in an event similar to the death of Brian Douglas Wells. If you disclose to police, the FBI, any federal or government agency, or anyone outside your family, these instructions, any future instructions, correspondence, payment details, or any other information related to this matter, whether contained here or elsewhere, this will immediately result in an event similar to the death of Brian Douglas Wells. Once you confirm receipt of this letter, detailed instructions will be provided regarding the transfer of a specified amount. If you, the transferring party, or the sending bank attempt in any way to communicate to the receiving bank or any third party, directly or indirectly, information not strictly necessary for processing the transfer, this will result in an event similar to the death of Brian Douglas Wells regardless of whether payment is received. If I or my banking consultant or embedded informants become aware that you, your family, or anyone else violated any condition before or after payment, you proceed entirely at your own risk. If the transfer instructions are followed correctly and payment is confirmed, I will immediately provide the combination capable of opening the case without causing an event similar to the death of Brian Douglas Wells, and the integrated key necessary to fully disable the explosive mechanism inside. Confirm receipt of these instructions by contacting Dirk Struan. So the most important point was this. The extortionist explicitly confirmed that the device attached to Maddie's neck was indeed intended to be a bomb collar. He described himself as a former U.S. Army Green Beret, something that might either provide investigators with a lead or simply serve to misdirect them. Detectives did not yet know which, but they immediately understood the reference to the death of Brian Douglas Wells. Brian made a living delivering pizzas. During what appeared to be a routine delivery, conspirators placed a bomb collar around his neck and gave him instructions to rob a bank. He entered the bank carrying a cane disguised as a firearm and demanded money while wearing the explosive device. He obtained less than $9,000 but was stopped shortly afterward by police. Tragically, the bomb exploded before bomb disposal officers could arrive, killing him in front of stunned officers and television news crews. The people responsible were eventually arrested. They were identified as Marjorie Deal Armstrong and Kenneth Barnes. Marjorie received a life sentence while her accomplice was sentenced to 45 years in prison. In a particularly bizarre twist, the bank robbery had been organized to obtain money to pay for the murder of Marjorie's father. It remains one of the more unusual and complicated criminal cases in recent history, and Netflix later released a documentary miniseries about it titled Evil Genius. So, after threatening catastrophe, the unknown man who placed the device on Maddie's neck concluded his message by promising instructions for disarming the mechanism and preventing an explosion, but only if his demands were met. Communication with the extortionist was to continue through the email address he provided. Determined not to overlook any opportunity, police sent an email posing as Maddie's father and asked for further instructions. No reply ever came. Naturally, police examined the device attached to Maddie's neck and concluded that it had been constructed professionally. The perpetrator had concealed the supposed explosive inside a small portable gun safe secured with a combination lock. Bomb disposal officers, explosive ordnance specialists, and forensic experts all inspected the device, but they were left puzzled. They could not determine what was inside or identify the type of explosive the bomber might have used. Even though this was the police force of New South Wales, Australia's most populous state, officers openly admitted they had never dealt with an explosive collar before. Rather than attempting to solve the problem alone, they reached out to anyone who might be able to help. Negotiators were called in. Fire crews were brought to the scene. Major crime investigators joined the operation. Police even contacted specialists connected to the British Army for advice on how to proceed. While the extortionist's letter was taken to a laboratory for fingerprint analysis, experts continued examining the device as Maddie patiently remained seated for hour after hour. First, they scanned the device using X-ray equipment, but learned nothing conclusive. Then a handler carefully led over Toby, a detection dog trained specifically to identify explosives, hoping he could detect explosive compounds inside the box. Toby gave no indication that explosives were present. At the same time, police explored other possibilities. They asked a female officer to act as Maddie. A portable safe containing explosives, and designed to resemble the one attached to Maddie's neck, was secured around the officer's neck. Investigators wanted to recreate the conditions the victim was experiencing to better understand how they might safely remove the device. Throughout all of this, Maddie sat bravely, hoping to hear something that might finally bring good news. The strain was not only emotional, but physical. Her entire body hurt because she was barely allowed to move. Although she was given water and apparently something to eat, the device hung heavily from her neck. She could not change position and became increasingly exhausted. The teenager was drained and was not even allowed to speak with her parents or brothers, whom police understandably kept at a safe distance. They could do nothing but worry about their daughter and sister from afar. But she was not alone. One courageous young woman stayed beside Maddie the entire time, doing everything she could to comfort her, without wearing any protective equipment. Constable Karen Loudon was herself a wife and mother to a 2-year-old son. She understood exactly what Maddie's parents must have been feeling. She also understood that everything could go wrong at any moment, for both herself and Maddie. Yet she chose to remain beside the teenager, trying to calm and distract her. She asked about school, family, friends, exams. In short, she talked about anything at all, anything to keep Maddie's thoughts away from the weight hanging around her neck. Finally, 10 hours after the stranger had entered the Pulver family home, specialists decided to attempt removing the device. They had repeatedly examined the small safe that supposedly contained explosives. It had been X-rayed multiple times. A trained explosive detection dog had inspected it. Everything pointed to the conclusion that there was no dangerous substance inside. Even so, this was not an easy decision. The world watched anxiously as events unfolded. And certainly no one felt that tension more than the Pulver family, and Maddie herself. It is difficult to imagine the thoughts circling through her mind during those 10 hours. Most of us have seen scenes like this in movies, but imagining something like that happening to you at any moment, that is a nightmare. Around midnight, specialists carefully removed the device from Maddie's neck, and with enormous relief discovered they had been right. It was a fake, a decoy, but the fear Maddie experienced had been completely real. Exhausted, Madeline Pulver was carried out of the house on a medical stretcher and taken to hospital, where doctors examined her. Her deeply relieved family was finally allowed to see her. At around 3 in the morning, doctors cleared Maddie to return home. According to her parents, she woke up the next day in surprisingly good spirits considering everything she had endured, though understandably, her entire body still ached. Once the immediate danger to Maddie had passed, detectives turned their attention to the investigation. First, they interviewed the teenager's parents. Investigators did not believe the family had been selected at random and assumed there had to be a motive, but the Pulvers themselves could not understand why they had become targets. Bill was the chief executive officer of a major analytics company. Belinda ran a landscape design business. Their children, Harry, Maddie, Angus, and Archie, were still in school. So yes, they were a well-off family. But they had never flaunted their wealth and were far from being the wealthiest or the only affluent family in Mossman. Even so, police increasingly believed whoever planned the attack had prepared in advance. The offender, or offenders, appeared to have selected their victims and monitored the house for days, perhaps weeks. They knew the family had a habit of leaving the front door unlocked. After all, Mossman was considered an exceptionally safe neighborhood, and they also knew that Maddie would be home completely alone, because it seemed difficult to believe the intruder had simply gotten lucky and happened to choose the one moment when 5 out of 6 family members would be absent. Officers thoroughly searched the house for clues, but it appeared that the best evidence had been left directly in front of them. The extortion letter, the device itself, and a green USB flash drive the offender had left behind at the scene. Let's begin with the email address listed in the letter. Of course, Dirk Struan is a fictional name, and it was not invented by the criminal. It was created by the well-known writer James Clavell, whose other famous works include Shogun and Noble House. In 1966, he published the novel Taipan, whose protagonist was Dirk Struan, a Scottish opium trader and founder of a powerful trading company in Hong Kong. A gifted, ruthless, and visionary figure known as the Green-Eyed Devil, Struan sought to make both his family and his company the most influential force in Asia. He is a deeply ambiguous character, more antagonist than hero, yet endowed with enough admirable qualities to make readers fascinated by him. A fake bomb, a fictional literary character. At first, it looked as though the entire thing might be some elaborate joke. But then investigators discovered that the email account itself was very real. It had been created only a few months earlier, on May 30th, at Chicago Airport. For the moment, at least, all the references to the United States appeared to fit together. The account had only been accessed 3 times since its creation, and all 3 runs occurred on the day of the attack on Maddie. But not from America. They came from Australia, from the Central Coast region, roughly an hour north of Sydney. The first login occurred at around 4 p.m. from the parking lot of Kincumber Library. 2 hours later, the account was accessed again from the parking lot of an electronics store in the town of Avoca. Fortunately for investigators, both locations had surveillance cameras, and unusually enough, they were working. The footage captured a man arriving first at the library and later at the second location in a gold-colored Range Rover. He remained in the vehicle while accessing the email account using a laptop. But in Avoca, he stepped out of the car and walked into a liquor store to buy wine. He appeared to be between 50 and 60 years old, and he was dressed in beige trousers and a blue shirt, exactly as Maddie had described. The cameras did not capture the vehicle's registration plate, but they did capture the make, color, and the driver. And what about the USB drive the offender left behind? At first glance, it seemed to contain nothing more than a copy of the 2-page extortion letter. There were also several deleted drafts of the same document. But when investigators examined hidden document metadata, they made an unexpected discovery. The files had been created on a computer belonging to a user identified as Paul P. Now investigators had a name, a computer type, and even a blurred image associated with this Paul P. At that point, it seemed like only a matter of time before he would be caught. You might ask, why leave the flash drive at all? It contained no additional information that the offender appeared to consider necessary. I don't have an answer, and, as events would later suggest, Paul himself may not have had one either. Given everything they had gathered, it did not take police long to identify a man living in the Central Coast suburb of Copacabana. His name was Paul Douglas Peters. He was 50 years old, an investment banker, and an aspiring writer. His appearance resembled the man captured on surveillance footage. The final piece of evidence came when investigators confirmed that Paul had purchased the USB drive and the purple cord on July 4th. Then, on July 16th, surveillance footage showed him buying a black baseball bat and a brightly colored ski mask from a JJ's store. Incidentally, JJ's later removed the mask from sale. Police wanted to arrest him immediately, but there was one small complication. Paul was no longer in Australia. On August 8th, just 5 days after his encounter with Maddie, he had left the country and flown to the United States, to Kentucky. Naturally, such a sudden departure made him look even more suspicious. Airport surveillance footage in Sydney confirmed that Paul had boarded the flight and departed for America. His destination was Louisville, Kentucky. Why there? Because his former wife, Deborah Lee Peters, lived there with their 3 children. The couple had divorced back in 2007, but remained on good terms. Roughly 2 weeks after the events in Mosman, detectives traveled to Kentucky to arrest the suspect and return him to Australia. A tactical team assisted in taking him into custody without incident. Inside the house, officers found a copy of Tai-Pan, one more detail suggesting that Paul was at the very least familiar with the novel. Who was Paul Peters? He was roughly the same age as Maddie's father, and like Bill, he had once been a successful businessman. But several years earlier, financial problems had begun to unravel his life and eventually contributed to his divorce. After the collapse of both his marriage and business, he struggled with depression and began turning to alcohol. The one thing that seemed to give him purpose was a book he was writing. He had never previously had trouble with the law. Nothing in his past appeared to suggest he would commit such an extraordinary crime. During initial questioning, he denied responsibility and described everything as a terrible coincidence. But before trial, he unexpectedly pleaded guilty, sparing Maddie and her family from having to endure a long and emotionally exhausting court process. But during the trial, the man claimed that he could not remember committing the crime. He remembered being in the Sydney neighborhood where the family lived. He even remembered walking up the steps to their house. But the next thing he knew, he was already back home. However, he admitted to a psychiatrist that he believed he had become a living embodiment of the protagonist of the novel he had been writing at the time, a character resembling Dirk Struan, the central figure of Tai-Pan. Paul suggested that he committed the crime while under the influence of this obsession. He had become consumed by the novel and felt as though he was literally living the life of his character. Immersed in the role and imagining himself as a powerful and dangerous antagonist, he decided to carry out such an audacious crime. At the same time, he had never met nor personally known any member of the Pulver family. He said he did not know why he had chosen them. But the prosecutor dismissed this explanation and argued that Paul Peters had invented the story about memory loss to preserve his dignity, instead of admitting that his plan had simply failed. The prosecution believed his intended target had actually been the Pulver's neighbor, a man with whom Paul had previously conducted business in Hong Kong. According to this theory, the would-be extortionist had simply gone to the wrong house. The prosecutor was convinced because during questioning, Paul had mentioned a fund in which he claimed $12 million of his assets had been frozen. And one of the 3 deleted files recovered from the flash drive contained extortion demands directed toward a person connected to that fund. So it is possible that Maddie had never been the intended victim, and that Paul originally planned to enter the neighbor's house, a man associated with a multi-million-dollar trust. However, one question remained unresolved. The device looked so convincing that even experts initially believed it could be deadly. Did Paul really build it himself? Because doubts about that still exist today. Where would an investment banker learn to construct something that convincing? Did he simply find instructions online? No definitive answer ever emerged. In the end, the court agreed with the prosecution. Paul was sentenced to 13.5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 10 years. After sentencing, Maddie told reporters that she was satisfied with the outcome and hoped Paul Peters' name would no longer remain permanently tied to hers. She emphasized that the sentence itself mattered less to her than knowing he would never repeat an attack like this. She also said she appreciated that the judge acknowledged the trauma inflicted on both her and her family. Paul publicly apologized to Maddie. She never responded. But her father, Bill Pulver, explained that his daughter suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and that encountering her attacker face-to-face somewhere in Sydney would be extremely difficult. For that reason, when Paul was released in August 2021 after serving 10 years, restrictions were placed on where he could appear in order to avoid contact with Maddie. It took Maddie Pulver a long time to rebuild a sense of normal life. Even so, she successfully finished school and sat the final exam she had been preparing for on the day of the attack. After graduation, she took some time to travel before enrolling in the communications program at the University of Technology, Sydney. Later, she developed a passion for interior design, which became the field she continues to work in today. In 2022, During the Easter long weekend, she married her partner, Angus Wood, in a small ceremony surrounded by close family and friends. It was described as a beautiful celebration. Sometime later, Maddie and Angus became parents. Neither Maddie nor her family have given extensive interviews about what happened. Instead, they consistently direct attention toward the New South Wales police officers, whom they regard as the real heroes. They seem determined to leave the attack behind, and that is understandable. Every member of the family has achievements and a life beyond that day. And as Maddie herself once said, she does not want her name to be associated only with Paul Peters and his fake bomb. As for another remarkably brave woman, Constable Karen Loudon, she was awarded the Star of Courage in recognition of her actions on the day of the crime. Imagine a place where the truth is known to everyone, but speaking it out loud is dangerous, where a last name matters more than the law, where a young woman's life can be worth less than the reputation of a powerful family. In the Argentine province of Catamarca Province, this was not a metaphor, it was reality. In 1990, the brutal murder of 17-year-old Maria Soledad Morales shook the nation and shattered the illusion of elite impunity. People swore, never again. But in 2020, history repeated itself. Another young woman, another son of a powerful family, another attempt to hide the truth. What changed over those 30 years? And did Catamarca change at all? Today, a story about power, impunity, and the women whose deaths changed a country. Catamarca Province is a high-altitude region in the Andes, known for its volcanoes, salt flats, and extreme mountain peaks. Tragically, in this picturesque place, provincial dynasties have long ruled with an iron hand, and young women have learned through bitter experience that some men are untouchable. Everyone knew the truth, but no one dared to say it out loud. That was the case until 1990, when one incident ignited a revolution the elite could not control. In 1990, Maria Soledad Morales was 17 years old. A quiet, diligent girl from a modest family, she took her studies seriously and dreamed of something beyond her small town. Her dreams ended on September 7th, when she attended a school fundraiser for the graduating class trip. She had no idea that she was being watched with open interest. Luis Raul Tula, a young local radio employee, and Guillermo Daniel Luque, the son of an influential congressman, pulled up beside her in a car belonging to Arnoldito Saadi, cousin of the province's governor, Ramon Saadi. Somehow, they convinced Maria to get into the car, but instead of taking her home, they drove her to a place where their friends were already waiting, sons and nephews of powerful men. Among them were Miguel Ángel Ferreira, the son of Catamarca's police chief, and Pablo Jalil and Diego Jalil, nephews of the mayor. Throughout the night, they subjected her to horrific abuse. Maria was given sedatives, forcibly injected with illegal substances, burned with cigarettes, beaten, and sexually assaulted. She was likely not their first victim, but this time, they went too far. When they realized she was no longer responsive, their only concern was avoiding scandal. Her lifeless body was carried to a car, driven away, and discarded like trash. 3 days later, Maria's disfigured body was found on a road 7 kilometers from the city. She was partially unclothed, her hair cut to conceal evidence, her body showing signs of having been dragged. The police arrived at their mission, as the saying goes, to serve and protect. But here, the sentence lacked its ending: protect the local elite. Officers saw the injuries, saw the brutality, yet attempted to cover up the truth. Witnesses were threatened. Fingerprints were not properly compared. The original report was altered. Authorities insisted she had died from a fall. The police chief even ordered Maria's body to be washed to destroy DNA evidence. Governor Ramon Saadi and the entire local political structure did everything possible to bury the case. The families of the suspects stood firmly behind them. Congressman Ángel Luque, Guillermo's father, even dared to say that if his son had been guilty, the body would never have been found. The message was clear: the life of a teenage girl meant less than the reputation of a political dynasty. But Catamarca underestimated its women. They refused to let Maria become just another line in a police report. Horrified by the injustice, Sister Martha Poloni organized a series of silent marches. the first of their kind in Argentina. The entire country watched as a small province rose up against men who believed themselves above the law and beyond consequences. Thanks to their persistence, the case was reopened. After years of silence and after the Saudi dynasty lost political power, the killers were brought to trial. Guillermo Daniel Luque was found guilty of rape and participation in the murder, and Luis Raul Tula was convicted as an accomplice. Although it was widely believed that 4 to 6 other men were involved, and justice was only partially served, it was something. Maria did not choose her fate, but her death broke a nation's silence. She toppled political giants and became a symbol for every girl harmed by a powerful man. 30 years later, the people of Catamarca province had not forgotten Maria. In this province, where powerful families still control politics and the economy, a new tragedy unfolded in early 2020. But could it be that, even if barely noticeable, some change had occurred? Early in the morning on March 1st, 2020, Maria Espeche opened the door to the room of her 24-year-old daughter, Brenda Micaela Gordillo. Although it was a Sunday, Brenda was expected at work at the Catamarca municipal office, so her mother, as usual, came to wake her. But this time, when Maria opened the door, she saw that her daughter's bed was empty. There was nothing unusual about that. Brenda was 24 and quite independent, so nothing prevented her from spending the night elsewhere, as she had done before. But when some time passed and Brenda had not appeared at home or at work, and she did not answer her phone, her family began to worry. Ivan, Brenda's 29-year-old older brother, decided to search for his sister. He knew her habits, favorite places, and many of her friends better than anyone. He went to all the places she usually visited. He even stopped by the hockey club, knowing that when she wasn't at work, she often spent time on the ice. He spoke with her friends, who told him they last saw Brenda in the evening when she had gone to a friend's birthday party. She left after midnight, and they never saw her again. Although Ivan couldn't find Brenda, he did spot her white Volkswagen in the central town square, clearly parked there since the previous night. Alarmed, the family combed the surrounding streets, questioned shopkeepers, and even asked passers-by. Maria, her mother, felt the fear every parent dreads. Something bad had happened to her daughter. The family contacted the police. The officers took the missing person report seriously, but the challenge lay in Brenda's remarkable privacy. She rarely shared with her family where she liked to go, who she met, or how she spent her evenings. Her mother and brothers knew she had friends she spent time with, and had once shown Ivan a photo of a boy she liked. That was all they knew. For the police, there was no clear starting point for the investigation. The first few hours are crucial in missing person cases, and just when the authorities should have been rushing to find her, they were already at a dead end. Night fell over the city, but Ivan couldn't sit still. He drove through the streets searching for his younger sister. Maria, too, didn't sleep that night. She listened for the slightest sound, hoping to hear her daughter's key turn in the lock. She kept checking Brenda's room, hoping she had somehow slipped back home unnoticed. But it was in vain, because someone had already provided the answers to all her questions. On March 1st, a young man, accompanied by his parents and a lawyer, walked into the Catamarca police station. His name was Naim Vera. His father, Oscar Vera, was a respected surgeon in the province, and his mother, Marcela Vera, a highly skilled kinesiologist. Both were top professionals, and the family was very influential. Oscar and Marcela had raised 4 sons, but the black sheep turned out to be 19-year-old Naim, who came to confess to committing a crime. The young man told police that he had spent Saturday night into Sunday with a female friend, with whom he had an exclusively intimate relationship. But that night, they argued, and in the heat of the quarrel, Naim's guest tripped and fell down the stairs. The fall proved fatal. Panicking instead of calling for help, the young man disposed of the body. Naim led the police to the apartment where he had spent time with the girl. The apartment belonged to his grandmother, but because it was conveniently located across from the National University of Catamarca, the family usually rented it to students. At the time, the apartment was vacant, and Naim had been using it for his own purposes. The officers were struck by the apartment's astonishing cleanliness. The air carried the scent of cleaning products, and the staircase gleamed so brightly that it was hard to imagine it could have been the site of the girl's death. But the worst was still to come. Naeem was about to lead the police to the girl's body, or rather, to what remained of it. First, Naeem pointed the police to a trash bin near the apartment. It was there that they discovered a charred half of the girl's body. The remains were burned beyond recognition. The second burned portion had been buried in a ravine by the Tala River on the outskirts of the city. In other words, Naeem had burned the girl's body and scattered the remains in 2 separate locations. Investigators had never seen anything like this in their careers. Naeem claimed that he barely knew the girl, that he didn't even know her last name or where she lived. Yet among his personal belongings, investigators found a card with the victim's social security number, which listed the name Brenda Michaela Gordillo. Naeem had kept the document even after disposing of the body. A gruesome trophy or mere carelessness? The investigators were not yet ready to answer that question. Many details remained unclear, but once they learned the victim's name, the police faced another grim and incredibly difficult task: informing Brenda's family of her death. Upon hearing the news, Maria fainted. She was so shocked that she spent several days in bed, unable to eat or drink. Meanwhile, the pathologist conducted an autopsy and confirmed the investigators' suspicions. Naeem had not told the whole truth, and what he had kept silent about was far worse than what he had already admitted. Brenda's death was not an accident. She had not fallen down the stairs. She died from asphyxiation, strangled with a piece of fabric forced down her throat. It was a torturous death, preceded by prolonged agony. But before she died, Brenda fought back, fiercely scratching her killer's skin. The police, in fact, noticed fresh scratches on Naeem's hands when they spoke with him at the station. From that moment, the authorities began investigating just how far the young man had gone in his lies. Here's the picture the investigators pieced together from surveillance footage and witness statements. On the night of March 1st, Brenda once again congratulated her friend on her birthday, said goodbye to the other friends, and went to meet Naeem, who had invited her on a date. She left her car in the square and entered the apartment at 1:48 a.m. Inside, Naeem suddenly attacked Brenda. He was about 30 centimeters taller than the fragile young woman and far stronger. The struggle, though desperate, was brief. He immobilized Brenda and strangled her, forcing her own clothing into her mouth. Brenda died in horrific agony, suffocating at the hands of someone she had trusted. Afterward, Naeem attempted something unimaginable. He placed her body on a grill, planning to cremate it by dousing it with strong alcohol he had bought in advance. But he miscalculated. Cremation requires temperatures sometimes reaching 1,200 degrees Celsius, whereas Naeem's grill could only reach about 400 degrees. The process went horribly wrong. Smoke drew the attention of neighbors. One neighbor, looking out her window, was shocked to see Naeem cooking something on the grill in the dead of night. But Naeem saw her too, and had the presence of mind to wave politely. The woman returned to bed. Meanwhile, under the heat and fire, Brenda's body split into 2 parts, and Naeem moved on to Plan B. He threw half of the body into a trash container near the apartment and transported the other half to the river, borrowing his father's van to get there. After burying the second half, he returned to his car and tried to collect himself. At that moment, 2 police officers noticed him. Showing no sign of nervousness, he explained that he had stopped to send a message while heading home. The officers let him go, unaware that they had just encountered the killer who had buried the second half of his victim's body. He still had a few important tasks to complete. He cleaned his grandmother's apartment, took a shower, changed clothes, washed the dirty garments, and finally returned his father's van. Then he sent a message to his friend Facundo Manzur Soria. That early morning, Facundo hadn't been asleep but was spending time with friends, and Naeem went to meet him. But the last thing Facundo expected to hear from his friend was this: he had killed Brenda. Naeem recounted the murder with terrifying frankness. He had previously told Facundo that Brenda was driving him crazy and that he would definitely kill someone, either her or himself. Facundo had always thought he was joking badly. He never imagined Naeem could be serious about wanting to kill someone, yet his friend's confession was disturbingly precise and detailed. Shocked, Facundo asked Naeem to leave and immediately contacted Naeem's brother, relaying what he had just heard. The brother shared the information with their parents, and together they persuaded Naeem to go to the police and report the crime. Interestingly, although none of Naeem's acquaintances believed he was capable of murder, they openly told his girlfriend Brenda that she could find someone better. Yes, to his girlfriend. She was his girlfriend, and his friends, including Facundo, were fully aware of their relationship. The two had met at a bar on November 24, 2019, and had started dating, a relationship Naeem would later try to disown. Yet he had a very significant reason for doing so. At the time of Brenda's death, they had known each other just over 3 months. In February, she told her boyfriend that she was pregnant. For Naeem, the news struck like a thunderclap on a clear day, a revelation that threatened to shatter all his dreams for the future. Naeem Vera had been an outstanding student, preparing to enter the University of Córdoba, one of the most prestigious universities in Argentina. Although he had excellent grades, his social status alone opened doors wherever he went. His family not only fully supported his ambitions, but was also more than willing to pay for his education in Córdoba. A brilliant future awaited him. So Naeem didn't hesitate. He immediately told Brenda that he intended to study and build a career, and that at 19 he was too young to become a father. He tried to persuade her to terminate the pregnancy, but she refused. She told him she would have the child, and he would be part of their son or daughter's life whether he liked it or not. She also informed Naeem that she had already consulted a lawyer. Naeem perceived the situation as a catastrophe, an obstacle to his future plans. He belonged to the provincial elite that considers itself above the rest of society. An unwanted pregnancy, a child conceived with a girl outside his social circle, was simply an unforeseen inconvenience. Naeem placed his ambitions above everything else, including 1 or 2 human lives. He decided that his problem, Brenda and her pregnancy, needed to disappear. Naeem began planning his girlfriend's murder. Unwilling to dirty his hands, he would have preferred to hire a hitman. Ideally, the person he hired would stab Brenda in the stomach, so she would lose the baby and possibly die along with it. Naeem even managed to establish contacts in criminal circles and reached people supposedly willing to take the job. But any reasonably serious hitman turned out to be far too expensive for him. He then asked friends for help, including Facundo Manzur Soria, but no one took his word seriously for even a moment. Desperate, he decided to carry out the plan himself. He spent time thinking through the details, where, how, and when Brenda would die, and put his diabolical plan into action on the evening of February 29th. He contacted Brenda and asked her to meet under a false pretext. Perhaps he let her believe he had changed his mind about the pregnancy and was ready to take responsibility for their future child. Brenda trusted him, of course, and suspected nothing. She died in horrific agony, betrayed by the man she loved. Her killer surrendered to the police only because he was persuaded to do so. And even then, he clung to a final hope that the medical examiner would fail to determine the true cause of death. If Facundo had not raised the alarm, and if Naeem's brother had chosen to cover for him, instead of going to the police, Naeem might have escaped justice. The trial began on May 5, 2021, marking a historic event for the province. For the first time since the case of Maria Soledad Morales, the hearing was fully recorded on video at the request of the civil parties. Naeem Vera became the youngest defendant ever tried for the murder of a woman in Catamarca. He was brought in under heavy security, as the police feared vigilante justice. He apologized to the victim's family and his own, but his words lacked sincerity. Perhaps this was because, as a psychiatrist determined, he exhibits traits of a narcissistic psychopath, a combination of pathological narcissism and psychopathy characterized by a lack of empathy, emotional coldness, and cruelty. Such individuals use psychological manipulation, humiliation, and sadism to control their victims, taking pleasure in power. It is an extremely toxic personality type, driven by a need for superiority. In reality, Naeem had not been very successful in hiding his true nature. One of his former classmates, Fernanda, reported that she had been regularly harassed by him. He and his friends insulted her in front of other students and even on the street, implying promiscuity. In an attempt to escape the nightmare, Fernanda changed schools. But that was not enough. Her harassers uploaded videos of her to an adult website, forcing her to leave the province permanently. Meanwhile, the defendant's lawyer tried desperately to argue that Naeem and Brenda were not a couple. Under Argentine law, A murder carried a potential sentence of 16 years, and with exemplary behavior, he could be released much sooner. But murdering one's own girlfriend and committing femicide are two aggravating circumstances, which meant Naeem faced life imprisonment. The difference, as you can see, was enormous. On May 14th, the court announced its verdict. Naeem Vera was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder with two aggravating circumstances. He must serve a minimum of 51 years and will only be eligible for parole when he is 71 years old. But do you know what's truly tragic in this story? Beyond the death of the girl, of course. In fact, Brenda was not pregnant. During the autopsy, the medical examiner was able to confirm with certainty that the victim was not preparing to become a mother at the time of her death. Worse still, she suffered from a serious gynecological condition, and her chances of conceiving naturally were virtually zero. Brenda had simply experienced a delayed menstrual cycle, and the pregnancy test had been a false positive. Naeem killed and burned Brenda to prevent her from giving birth to a child who never existed. All they would have needed to do was visit a hospital together for him to see that she was not pregnant. Naeem murdered the girl solely to avoid taking responsibility for a potential fatherhood. He could never imagine her perspective, because he considered himself far superior to her in terms of gender and social standing. Outwardly a normal young man from a privileged family, he concealed within him a misogynistic monster, willing to kill to preserve his personal comfort. 30 years after the brutal murder of Maria Soledad Morales, a new tragedy unfolded in Catamarca, this time involving another narcissist convinced he could escape accountability. But this time, justice prevailed. Neither his friend, nor his brother, nor his parents attempted to shield him, despite everything. This means that positive changes in public consciousness have already occurred, perhaps invisible at first glance, but they exist.